the roles of leaders and educators in diversity and inclusion in the educational space. We're joined this morning by Dr. George Akomas, Executive Leadership Coach, and word on the streets, rumor has it that can I finish? Rumor has it that he's actually #1 in Africa. Good morning, Dr. George.
Thank you. Good to be here.
Good to have you here on the show this morning, Dr. George. All right. Before we talk about the word on the street,
I was going to put that, right?
Before we talk about the word on the street, we started the show with a conversation on diversity and inclusion in the educational system. And of course, we have our own biases and everything, but we opened our comment section for individuals that are watching the show to send in comments. And there's this particular interesting one that I want to read out, and I want to hear your view on it. So this is from Kubi from Lagos. And Kubi says, well, I mean, the question is, in your opinion, does the educational system of the world support diversity and inclusion? And how can they support it? So Kubi says, well, I can't say yes, I can't say no. My reason is because some countries practice more diversity and inclusion in the educational system than others do. Nigeria, for example, practice more of gender inequality even in education, and that is why there is such a thing as boys-only school and girls-only school. I think it's safe to say that the percentage of schools around the world practicing diversity and inclusion is less than those not practicing it, and it's going to go on like this until each and every one of us take it upon ourselves to promote inclusion and diversity everywhere, not just in the educational sector. What do you think?
I would agree with her to an extent, but there has to be more context to it. I mean, foreign schools, outside Nigeria, have more policies in place. International students bring in good money. As a lecturer myself, we are taught, going through your teaching practice education, to be more inclusive. Whether lecturers are more inclusive or not is a different story, but they appreciate overseas the importance of diversity and inclusion and have policies in place. In Nigeria, to some extent, I mean, when you talk about diversity, there are about 34 different groups you can consider. I mean, if you could have an all-boys school, but you look at the intertribal mix-up of that group. The focus, I think, has been mostly on that with Nigeria in terms of federal character. Gender, I don't think as much, and maybe other groups. It's a journey. I mean, the world is a global village, and we're not there yet. It's a journey, but I think we're on the right path.
But when it comes to gender-based schools, like boys-only schools and girls-only schools, I think the conversation of diversity and inclusion becomes interesting because we're seeing a literal example, a literal case study of gender segregation in the space of learning, which is something that, I don't really buy into. I don't think when we're, especially within the context of the conversation of diversity and inclusion, there's one thing that I remember we had a conversation on Tea or Coffee when we were talking about the social inclusion of children.
Yes.
Teaching children how to deal with, their sociality, how to socialize properly in a community. And that requires, I would think, both genders learning in the same space. What's your take on that?
I went to both. So I went to a mixed school for 3 years and a boys' school for 3 years. And I agree with you that there has to be that social inclusion. Now, in the early days when we had these schools, we have to consider what was the motive behind them in terms of the moral character, the way that boys were raised and girls were raised differently. There might be things we want to teach some in terms of behavior. What is a man? All those things, right? Does it still apply now? That's an argument up for debate. In those days, however, what they did, they had interactions with the girls-only school where people were chaperoned. It is changing now.
Okay.
It should be up for discussion. Whether it's right or wrong is a different debate altogether. But, I mean, would I get anything different from them? I think I did miss out on the social interaction with the females. It was a bit socially awkward for years after that. But it is an important topic and an interesting topic, and I think we should be looked at again.
Yeah. All right, so let's have a look at the next comments. This one is Bishop from Lagos. Bishop from Lagos is saying, laughing out loud, I have been asked a similar question before. Who is to blame for inequality? Anyways, I believe we can't entirely entirely measure it. The world is big, culture definitely differs, and so does the educational systems across the globe. So I can't entirely give an answer to the first question. However, the second question is highly necessary. I think first we need to stop playing the blame game. Many blame teachers and educators for this lack of diversity in their fields, forgetting that they don't get to pick the students they teach. It's the system that chooses for them. You don't get to say, hello, I'd like a couple of American kids and some from Nigeria, and while you're at it, could I have some Sri Lankan boys, maybe a few Christians and Muslims? It's just the way it is. We live in a world that prohibits equality. We need to check our culture and correct what's termed acceptable and not acceptable. You know, Bishop is coming from a place where it seems that in our society, in our community, a lot of blame, you know, a lot of fingers are pointed towards the teachers, towards, you know, educators, you know, towards lecturers, that what it's some of the things that you are teaching these children that is probably making them closed-minded. But, you know, I know before we came on set this morning, we're talking about the role of education in alienating ignorance. Does education always alienate in ignorance in your experience as a leader and educator?
That's a loaded question. Motive comes into play here. I mean, there are three groups of people. Those who know and are willfully exploiting others' ignorance for their personal benefits.
All right.
You have those who don't know any better and acting out of past fears and insecurity. And then those who want to make a difference, right? So education, I always believe, should. Now, I like to define what education is because we've always been going to schools in education.
Yeah.
Education is not always in the classroom. It should be. The classroom is designed for education. And if properly designed, should be able to alienate some of these things with the right instructor in place. I mean, if there's a lecturer who does not feel comfortable with a different group, who doesn't like a different group, he won't do anything about it. So, for me, more importantly, was something he said earlier on, that look at who to blame for this. I think we're all to blame. Every one of us. So even in a classroom, I remember the first time I ever encountered a Muslim student in a primary school where I went to, where there was no Muslim kid. He was the first one. I won't forget that. His name was Bala. And the way the students reacted to a student who a Muslim who they never met before was almost embarrassing, though. Following him around, asking him ridiculous questions like, who's Allah, and stuff like that. Parents are to blame. For the lack of school, teachers are to blame. As we grow older, what do we do to educate ourselves about these things? So we all have a part to play in this whole issue of inequality. So even if the teacher's not doing the right thing, what do you do about it? So it's everybody, basically. Everyone's responsibility.
Interesting.
Okay, we'll get into this next comment from Akiri Sola from Abuja. Akiri Sola says, I think this is a question for principals, teachers, and lecturers, superintendents, managers, etc., since we can be confident that teachers do their level best to teach the students they have. There is no teaching of diversity and inclusions when there is no diversity in that very classroom. Don't waste a moment talking about it. Words won't work. About the solution is to get a diverse student population and treat them all the same. That's promoting diversity and inclusion. The only value in diversity is to demonstrate it and not preach it or teach it. Show it. Talk is cheap. Okay, so when we started the show, I was telling Ade that charity begins at home, really. And if you are going to talk about diversity and inclusion, what's the conversation you are having at home? The parent or the teacher that is not diverse is a child that grew up in a tribalistic home or a racist home or something like that and goes on to pass on that knowledge. But my question is, how can the educational system correct that? Really, what can they do? Like, because I mean, he was saying the superintendents, the principals, and all of these people are to blame. And this is already in this person's modus operandi. This is already who they are. That's how they see it. It doesn't mean they're not intelligent or they're not good at doing their job. However, they are, segregating people. I mean, I've seen videos where you enter a class and they don't ask, a certain person of color to sit at this particular side and this other person to sit at this particular side, or oh, you're covering your head or something, don't sit with this person and all of that. It doesn't change the fact that this teacher isn't brilliant. But what can be done, really?
Two groups now. I like this group thing. So for those who are actively, again, based on their own biases, doing this to these children, we need re-education. Again, it's from their own experiences, from their childhood that they carry these things over. But more interestingly too, was the example something he mentioned earlier about when you don't have a diverse school. You don't need to have a diverse school.
All right.
Especially for children. Create curiosity. I'm fascinated with Nigerian culture. So I will never forget in primary 5, when in social studies, I learned about the history of the Yoruba people. Oduduwa 7 sons. Never seen anywhere else. Since primary 5, never forgotten that. The origin of the Hausa people and the Hausa Banzai and stuff like that. Primary 5, never forgot. It was a fascinating story. To illustrate this a bit further, why is it that when we go overseas, we don't have that same distrust? We're fascinated. TV. So we're talking like Americans in Britain because we watch a lot of American TV. With things we see on TV, we're trying to find out, is this real? Is this true? Why don't we do that here? So it's not just about not being diverse. There's some areas, I mean, in the interior parts of certain areas, you may not have that much diversity. But what are we exposing these children to? For the educators who are passive or who don't know better, bring into the classroom. Cultural day. Ask them, give them assignments to investigate a different culture. What do these people eat? When you create curiosity in a child, you're soon to see that will turn into a great tree.
Yeah. All right. So to kick off the conversation, what is diversity and inclusion? Let us start from that particular base. Before we now get into the nitty-gritties, of the conversation. What do we mean when we're saying diversity and inclusion?
I'll give one of my favorite quotes by a leading expert in diversity and inclusion. Says, diversity is being invited to the party, inclusion is being asked to dance.
Okay.
But in Nigerian context, when you go to a party you're not invited to and you dance when nobody asks you or not really hit home. So in Nigerian context, I would say diversity is being invited to the party or coming to the party whether they're invited or not. After dancing, whether they're asked to dance or not, coming to the table and seeing a buffet and being able to pick what you want.
Yes.
That is very true.
So basically, I mean, diversity is what makes us unique. What are the different things about us? But gender, age, background, whether you come from a single parent family or have both parents present, there are all kinds of things that make us different. Inclusion, though, is about letting each of these groups come to the table and participate. Being able to say, well, whatever benefits are available, being able to contribute to the best of their ability, how they want.
Do you think that the educational system in the world actually buys into the idea of diversity and inclusion?
They're trying to. Like I said earlier on, international students bring in the money.
Yeah.
So there are policies in place. Well, where I teach in the UK, they buy into that a lot. That I know. I've been taught that the teacher training programs, they encourage you to have activities that are more inclusive in terms of learning abilities, in terms of cultural abilities. Even when we mark assignments, we take in consideration that English may not be their first language. You don't judge them based on that. For Nigeria, again, federal character is what we have. There's more work that needs to be done on that area in terms of other areas, in terms of gender, in terms of even stuff like for the blind and those who have hearing impairments. This all diversity. How are they able to participate? We still have a long way to go in Nigeria. Outside, yes, that journey is going on. Where I teach, we have an African center, which was to celebrate the Africans and their contributions to the university, to support them whatever they can. So we are getting there. It's still a long journey.
All right, so you were explaining federal characters, and I want to ask you this too. Diversity and inclusion, how important is it in the educational system? How big is it? Is it? Are we making a big deal out of it, or is it just something minute?
I think I'll make enough deal out of it. But like I said with the leaders, right, there is a whole wealth of experience. We talked about kids in primary school,
Yes.
right? And as much as I said you don't have to have it, the older we get, the more we need to have it. So they're better prepared to deal with different people when they go out. I think this whole fear of diversity stems back to our forefathers, our ancestors, where if someone is different from you, you should be scared. Because if it looks different, he could be coming to steal your food. So it's an alarm bell. No, 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 no. But now that the world is changing and it's one big village, or small village, gets smaller by the day, we should be doing something. We should be intentional about how we include this. So I think we should focus on getting people more included. Again, I try to avoid focusing on diversity because most people think of diversity in terms of numbers. Oh, we need more men or women or physically challenged people or whatever it is. And in doing that, it becomes almost transactional. But if we're saying, how do we include these people? So when they come and encourage them to come, they feel safe. Inclusion is about feeling safe too, to have these conversations, to be able to come here and give your best, not just, oh, you're in, we've done our part. So I think we should make more noise about it.
Yeah, I like the case study you cited about the African Center in the university that you work in. That's also obviously in the United Kingdom,
Yes.
isn't it, right? So let's now come back home. How can leaders in this country, leaders from diverse cultures, how can they use their cultural differences to create value that instead of segregating us further, actually includes us? Because as given with the case study you gave, that is a European country
Yes.
making an African center. So recognizing and appreciating the value that Africans in that particular university bring to that community and to that educational space. So how can we make something like that work, for instance, in a country like Nigeria?
We have a long way to go. So we're not building any buildings for anybody just yet. I want to focus more on cultural nuance, not differences.
Okay.
Because, I'm here in the country because the Federal Character Commission had a conference recently, and they were looking at equality, fairness, and justice. And what I suggested in the paper that I presented is that because we focus on our differences, we don't even know who we are. So you say I'm Yoruba, I'm Igbo, I'm Hausa, but what does that actually mean? That when we go back to what it means to be from one of these tribes and find out what values we have, then we can better contribute to the society. And that's where we should start from.
Yeah.
I found some I'll give an example, really interesting story about the justice system in our old society. It wasn't about punishment or retribution, was about restoring balance to society. I found this Yoruba proverb. I can't speak Yoruba, so I can't. The English version says that, is it ahun? How do you pronounce A-H-U-N?
Ahun, yes, a stingy person.
That's what it means.
Yeah.
That gives some more insight to the story. That he could be blamed in the morning, but his father-in-law has the blame in the evening because, real quickly, his father-in-law was losing yams in his barn. So he goes into the barn one day and hides to see who's stealing his yams. And then you know the story? Know the story?
Yeah.
Interesting. Do you know it?
I don't know.
Okay.
I do know
So
the story.
he finds that Ahun was person stealing his yam, catches Ahun, takes the yams, ties them around him and ties them to a tree. So in the morning, people are coming out and like, how wicked could, what a wicked son-in-law he is. Can you imagine how shameful, you're a thief, Blamed him. By the evening when they come back, he was still there. He was tired and exhausted and hungry. And his father-in-law had not untied him. And they were like, what a wicked man. If he could do this to his son-in-law, what would he do to a stranger? So that the punishment was supposed to restore that balance of harmony between he and his son-in-law and not be punitive in nature. And that's what it was. That's what our culture was. Is that reflected in our systems today? So I think that what we need to do first is to understand what our real values are and then come to have that conversation. Because at the end of the day, as different as we are, we're still the same.
Okay.
So whatever nuances we have in our culture, we should celebrate them and see how we can contribute to those different ways. So I think that's the first conversation. We need to start with that conversation before we start building centers for anybody else. We need to appreciate each other. We don't yet. We don't. Someone from this tribe looks at another tribe. Even within different ethnic groups, you have those that are considered a bit more higher than others. We need to learn to appreciate each other first and change that narrative. You know the story. It should be told more often. Stories like that to encourage us to appreciate one another first before we do anything else.
Yeah. I mean, before we wrap up this conversation, Ade shared his experience when it has to do with diversity and inclusion of an autistic student and how he was able to handle that situation. Has any of these things happened to you while lecturing or having your leadership conferences?
I think the highlight for me in teaching diversity was in getting the response I have from my students, because I already knew that this was an issue. But I teach diversity as part of a leadership module. I teach third-year students. And when it came to the topic of diversity, what I did, first of all, for leaders too, I encourage people, be honest. That's how we can drive the conversation as leaders, be honest. I talked about the Harvey Weinstein story, and the impact it had on me. I began to ask myself questions. Am I like this? Have I said something to someone to offend them before? And I thought outside a movement called the Better Man Challenge, which didn't work, obviously. So when I come to class, I tell them that story. I get the girls in my class to talk about their experiences and how it affected them being treated in a certain type of way. I get the men in the class to respond to that and make pledges to do better. The response from that is humbling. That these girls feel emboldened, these boys feel humbled. That is priceless.
It's very nice.
All right. Okay, just to wrap up the conversation now, I want you to send a goodwill message to some of our viewers watching this morning on why diversity and inclusion is not just important in our education system, but in our community and our society at large. So just, like a brief, sign off.
What camera should I look at?
That will be your cover. So just a quick message on the importance of diversity and
How many does I have?
2 minutes stops.
I want to start by telling a story. A friend of mine, Fumim Sweli, she's one of the biggest career coaches in Africa, told me when she was young, she didn't like people. She loved books. There were beautiful stories about faraway places and magical places in books. Her grandfather found it amusing and told her that the world you're reading about in these books here is actually out there. And encouraged her to see people as books. There is so much we can learn about different people, about ourselves, if we can only open our minds, not just to see the beauty in those differences or nuances, but also see how much they are like us and include them in what we do. How'd that go?
All
That
right.
was beautiful. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much,
Thank you very
Dr.
much,
George,
Dr.
for joining
It
us
was
this
really
morning.
lovely having you on the show.
It was great to be here. Let's do this again sometime.
Definitely, certainly.
By the
we
way,
should.
when I walked in here, I sat down with you guys before this stuff started. Coffee or tea? Was that because of the show?
See, probably, yes.
Tea or
It just clicked now.
Yeah, but
That's what I said with a smile. I thought, that was standard service because
we got you there.
We got you. Thank you so much, Dr. George.
Thanks so much, Amy. It was a great time with you guys.
All right, there you have it, the conversation on the role of leaders and educators in the conversation of diversity and inclusion. This is where we wrap it up.